another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Kathy, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 1st issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. U.S. strikes Iran. Trump calls for overthrow of government. Attack with aid from Israel risks a broader conflict. This article is by Aaron Boxerman, Tyler Pager, Farnaz Fasihi, and Ronan Bergman. The United States and Israel attacked Iran on Saturday in a major assault that threatened a broader regional conflict, with President Trump vowing to devastate the country's military, eliminate its nuclear program, and bring about a change in its government. Waves of large explosions shook the Iranian capital, Tehran, starting around 9 a.m. local time, 1 a.m. in Washington, and witnesses described chaos in the streets as people rushed to seek shelter, find loved ones, or flee the city. Israel's military said it had, in part, targeted a gathering of senior Iranian officials in the opening strikes. Satellite imagery showed a plume of smoke and extensive damage at the high-security compound of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. Though the status of Iran's leadership was not immediately known, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, told NBC News that Ayatollah Khamenei and Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, were still alive, as far as I know. Mr. Trump had threatened an attack for weeks, saying earlier that he was considering limited strikes to compel Iran to accept U.S. terms for a deal restricting its nuclear program. Instead, he launched a much more ambitious venture that analysts call more perilous. The president said in a video posted to Truth Social on Saturday that in addition to targeting Iran's nuclear program, the United States would also raise their missile industry to the ground and annihilate their navy and enable the overthrow of the Iranian regime, arguing that Iran had refused to reach a deal that would have averted war. Dozens of U.S. strikes were carried out by attack planes from bases and aircraft carriers around the Middle East, with officials saying the initial focus was military assets. Israel said it was also bombing dozens of sites across the country. Mr. Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, promised that Iran's army will teach aggressors the lesson they deserve. He added that by attacking Iran, Mr. Trump was serving the interests of Israel, which Iran considers its main regional rival, rather than the United States. Just as Iranians began their work week on Saturday morning, U.S. and Israeli strikes sent panicked residents of Tehran into the streets and parents racing back to schools where they had just dropped off their children. Chaos and uncertainty set in as explosions shook the densely populated city, Iran's capital, according to witnesses who spoke to the New York Times. In the Pasdaran area, where a large compound belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guards forces is, residents heard multiple explosions that shook their windows. "My children are crying and scared. We are huddling in the bathroom. We don't know what to do. This is terrifying." Esfandiar, an engineer living in the area, wrote in a text message. In retaliation, Iran fired waves of ballistic missiles at Israel, prompting booms as Israeli air defenses sought to repel them. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, all of which host U.S. military bases, said they had come under attack, as did Jordan. Falling debris from an Iranian ballistic missile attack killed at least one person in the Emirates, according to its government. Analysts warned that the fighting could easily devolve into a protracted war with no clear exit. Mr. Araghchi asked in a letter for the UN Security Council's intervention, saying Israel and the United States had violated international law in attacking Iran. The United States and the Israeli regime shall bear full and direct responsibility for all ensuing consequences, including any escalation arising from their unlawful actions, Mr. Araki said. In a video posted to Truth Social, Mr. Trump suggested that the conflict might end with Iranians overthrowing their own authoritarian government after the American assault. "It will be yours to take," Mr. Trump said, speaking to the Iranian public. "This will probably be your only chance for generations." Standing behind a lectern and wearing a white USA hat, Mr. Trump argued the Iranian regime has posed a threat to the national security of the United States for 47 years, ever since the revolution of Iran led to the installation of a theocratic government there. He ticked through a list of Iranian-led attacks that targeted Americans over the last 4 decades, starting with the hostage crisis that began in 1979, and called for the Iranian people to take over your government after the strike's end. "For many years, you have asked for America's help, but you never got it," he said in a message directed to the Iranian people. "No president was willing to do what I am willing to do tonight. Now you have a president who is giving you what you want, so let's see how you respond. America is backing you with overwhelming strength and devastating force." The president said the U.S. military campaign was aimed at Iran's missiles, its navy, and its proxy groups in the region, and warned that there could be U.S. casualties. Iranian state media reported that one of the attacks on Saturday had struck a girls' elementary school in the southern town of Minab. Multiple Iranian news outlets reported that dozens of students had been killed, with one report saying more than 80 were dead. Iran's state news agency, IRNA, said there were about 40 killed and 48 injured. "We are aware of reports concerning civilian harm resulting from ongoing military operations," a spokesman for U.S. Central Command said Saturday. "We take these reports seriously and are looking into them." Britain, France, and Germany issued a joint statement that fell short of complete support for the attacks. Prime Minister Keir Starmer of Britain, President Emmanuel Macron of France, and Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany called for a resumption of negotiations over Iran's nuclear program and urged the Iranian leadership to seek a negotiated solution. "We reiterate our commitment to regional stability and to the protection of civilian life," they said in the statement. The latest U.S. military strikes on Iran came roughly 8 months after American forces bombed 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, attacks that directly involved the United States in Israel's 12-day war on Tehran. Those June attacks came after Mr. Trump, who campaigned against American interventionism and has built himself as a peacemaker, lost patience with diplomatic efforts and shifted his position on Iran under pressure from Israel. Israel set off the war on June 13, 2025, with surprise attacks across Iran that took out much of its defense capabilities and killed a string of its senior military commanders and nuclear scientists. Israel's widespread bombing campaign in the following days destroyed Iranian military, government, and nuclear sites, but also multiple apartment buildings in densely populated neighborhoods, a TV broadcasting station broadcasting the news, and a prison. The United States on June 22nd fired bunker-busting bombs and a barrage of missiles at 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, including 2 major uranium enrichment centers. Mr. Trump quickly declared that Iran's nuclear program had been completely and totally obliterated. But initial assessments by the U.S. and Israeli militaries were far more cautious, and senior Trump administration officials conceded that they did not know the status of Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium. In all, the Israeli strikes killed more than 1,000 Iranians, most of them civilians. Iran's retaliatory strikes on Israel killed 31 people, according to Israel's foreign ministry. As the new airstrikes unfolded on Saturday, Tehran acted swiftly on its promise to hit back, targeting U.S. interests across the Middle East in a wide-ranging retaliation that risked a broader regional conflict. Iran's semi-official news agency, Fars, reported that Iranian missile attacks had targeted U.S. military facilities, including the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Ali Arsalam Air Base in Kuwait, Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, and the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Jordan's state-run news agency also reported that the country's military had intercepted 2 ballistic missiles that entered its airspace, though it did not say where the missiles were launched from. The Emirati Defense Ministry said that it had successfully intercepted several missiles launched from Iran, but that missile debris had landed in a residential neighborhood in Abu Dhabi, killing 1 person and damaging property. Qatar's defense minister also said that it had intercepted at least 2 waves of missile attacks. In a statement, the Qatari Interior Ministry said that no casualties or property damage had been reported in residential areas. Saudi Arabia condemned the brutal Iranian aggression on its fellow Arab states, saying it was a blatant violation of their sovereignty. Sirens blared across Israel in the hours after it launched attacks on Iran. The Israeli news media reported Iranian missile strikes in Tirat Carmel in the Haifa district, where a large fragment hit a residential building, causing structural damage and injuring 1 resident. In al-Fam and another community in northern Israel, minor injuries were reported. Debris and impact sites were also located in Jerusalem, Beit Shemesh, Kafr Manda, Kafr Harif, and southern areas of Israel. No casualties have so far been reported in Israel, apart from those injured while making their way to shelters, Israel's emergency service, Magen David Adom said in a post on social media. Trump's War of Choice, with a key question, why now? By David E. Sanger. With his broad attack on Iran early Saturday morning and his call to the Iranian people to overthrow their government, President Trump has embarked on the ultimate war of choice. He was not driven by an immediate threat. There was no race for a bomb. Iran is further from the capability to build a nuclear weapon today than it has been in several years, thanks largely to the success of the president's previous strike on Iranian nuclear enrichment sites in June. While Mr. Trump claimed Tehran was ultimately aiming to reach to the United States with its array of missiles, even his own Defense Intelligence Agency concluded last year that it would be a decade before Iran could get past the technological and production hurdles to produce a significant arsenal. And there were no indications of a coming Iranian attack on the United States, its allies, or its bases in the region. Instead, Mr. Trump struck the Islamic Republic largely because he apparently sensed a remarkable moment of weakness for the government and an opportunity for the United States to topple Ayatollah al-Khamenei and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps after 47 years of episodic confrontations, which he described at length in an 8-minute video. But unlike past presidents putting American forces at risk, and in an age of terrorism and cyber attacks, perhaps civilians as well, Mr. Trump did not spend months building a case for war. He never presented evidence of an imminent threat or answered the question of why a nuclear program he claimed he had obliterated 8 months ago was now on the brink of revival. His pre-taped video, released in the middle of the night as the missiles started exploding in Tehran, recited a list of long-running grievances with Iran, including its brutal use of terror. But he never explained why in the pantheon of threats facing the United States, including an already nuclear-armed North Korea and the expanding nuclear arsenals and territorial ambitions of Russia and China, Iran ranks first. So in choosing this moment and this vector of attack, a man who came to office promising an end to reckless military interventions and wars intended to prompt regime change is taking a huge risk. There are few, if any, examples in history of toppling the government of a large nation, in this case about 90 million people, with air power alone. And yet Mr. Trump has made clear that is his plan. He has no intention, administration officials have insisted, of sending in ground troops to finish the job, the invitation to the forever wars that he campaigned against. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The idea that we're going to be in a Middle Eastern war for years with no end in sight, there is no chance that will happen. Vice President J.D. Vance, who was famously skeptical of American military interventions and openly called for the United States to withdraw support from Ukraine, told the Washington Post days before the attack on Iran. So Mr. Trump's strategic bet rides almost entirely on the ability of the Iranian people, largely unarmed and unorganized, to seize the moment and overthrow a government that millions of them find both brutal and odious. The protests that filled the streets of Iranian cities and led to a crackdown that killed thousands gave him his chance. But if Mr. Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, who urged him starting in December to launch this war and who joined in from the start, have a plan to accomplish that goal, they have yet to reveal it, even to their closest allies. Senior officials of 3 of those allies, ranging from Europe to the Gulf and interviewed in the past few days, said that in their interactions with Mr. Trump's top aides, they heard little enthusiasm for these attacks and no plausible legal justification for striking Iran now. Those officials spoke on condition of anonymity to describe private discussions. But their experience partly explains why Britain, America's closest ally, barred the United States from using Diego Garcia and bomber bases in Britain to launch American fighters and bombers. It is not as if Iran poses a threat to our interests that it hasn't for 47 years, said Richard N. Haas, the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of the 2009 book War of Necessity, War of Choice, a study of the 2 conflicts with Iraq in 1991 and 2003. The first, he concluded, was defined by narrow and achievable aims, liberating Kuwait over Saddam Hussein invaded. Once Iraq was driven from Kuwait territory, President George H.W. Bush decided against overthrowing Hussein. But Mr. Trump's decision on Saturday was more like President George W. Bush's decision to rid the world of Hussein and his government because of the long-festering threat it posed to international peace. As in the Second Iraq War, there wasn't a necessity to attack Iran, there was an opportunity, Mr. Haas said. This is a classic preventative attack to keep Iran from gaining a capability in the future. What's missing is why now? Because there were other choices. Diplomatic accords under military pressure, economic embargoes, interceptions of Iranian ships. In international law, the difference between a war of necessity and a war of choice is huge. A preemptive strike, where one nation sees an attack massing across the river or the ocean and strikes first, is considered legitimate. A preventive strike, in which the powerful hit the weaker state, is considered illegal. An example would be Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, which the United States and much of the world denounced as a gross violation of the international order. Mr. Trump's response is that he did not need a precipitating event. He ran through more than 4 decades of deadly Iranian actions, from the 1979 hostage crisis, which lasted 444 days, to attacks on American bases and ships. We're not going to put up with it any longer, Mr. Trump said in a recorded video he posted on his social media account. And even the Pentagon's name for the mission, Operation Epic Fury, seemed to reflect the accumulation of grievances. The international legal ramifications are not likely to influence Mr. Trump's view of the attack. I don't need international law, he told 4 reporters from the New York Times during an interview in January. I'm not looking to hurt people. And he added that while he thought his administration should abide by international legal principles, he made it clear he would be the arbiter of when those principles applied to the United States. It depends on what your definition of international law is, he said. It may also depend on what the definition of war is. In his statement, Mr. Trump called this action a war, warning the country that may have to confront casualties. But he made no effort to seek an authorization to use military force, much less a war declaration from Congress. He would certainly not be the first president to initiate a major military action without formal approval from Congress. But in Mr. Trump's case, he has dismissed the thought that he even needs it. When historians look back at this moment, they are likely to ask two questions. Why did Mr. Trump act now, and why was Iran his target? The first may not be hard to answer. He sees himself as the only American president since the 1979 Iranian Revolution with the courage and determination not to let the problem fester. For many years, you have asked for America's help, but you never got it, he told the Iranian people in his video early Saturday. No president was willing to do what I am willing to do tonight. Now you have a president who is giving you what you want, so let's see how you respond. Add to the fact that the Iranian government sought to have Mr. Trump killed during the 2024 campaign, according to an indictment issued during the Biden administration. Presidents tend to take that kind of thing personally. The second question is harder. The accusations Mr. Trump made about Iran, especially about its missile and nuclear capabilities, are far easier to prove in the case of another longtime adversary, North Korea. It has 60 or more nuclear weapons and regularly tests missiles that are designed to reach Los Angeles or Chicago, even if they have not yet been proven to go the distance. But North Korea is not weak. For 20 years, it has possessed the nuclear weapons that Mr. Trump says he must prevent Iran from ever getting. It can strike back if its leadership seems in mortal danger, in ways the Ayatollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards cannot. In the end, Mr. Trump's venture, his seventh attack on a foreign nation since he came to office, may be judged by whether it ignores the Churchill rule. Long before he became Britain's wartime prime minister, Winston Churchill wrote about his youth as a journalist and sometimes participant in wars. Never, never, never believe any war will be smooth and easy, or that anyone who embarks on the strange voyage can measure the tides and hurricanes he will encounter, he wrote in My Early Life. The statesman who yields to war fever must realize that once the signal is given, he is no longer the master of policy, but the slave of unforeseeable and uncontrollable events. Trump sows fears about election interference, by Shane Goldmacher and Nick Corasaniti. Ahead of the midterm elections, an emboldened President Trump has shown increased eagerness to leverage the full investigative, prosecutorial, and legislative powers of the federal government to bend election mechanics to his will. With his words and deeds, the president, who pushed to overturn his 2020 defeat but declared his 2024 victory legitimate, appears to be undermining Americans' trust that the midterms will be free and fair. As the political environment darkens for his party, Mr. Trump is again warning Republicans that Democrats are going to rig the results. At the same time, he is taking actions that make Democrats fear that Republicans are actually going to subvert the election. Mr. Trump has shown himself unbound by precedent in his second term, and with prominent election deniers in powerful federal posts and top cabinet officials on the hunt for evidence of voter fraud, his moves have heightened anxieties about potential interference. He has called for Republicans to nationalize elections, though the Constitution leaves their administration to the states. The newly politicized Justice Department is suing states for private voter rolls. The FBI has seized ballots from the 2020 election from a Georgia election center, and Mr. Trump was so personally invested that he praised some of the agents by phone. Beginning on his first day in office and continuing for the past year in plain view of the American people, Donald Trump has orchestrated and led a sweeping federal government effort to subvert the midterm elections, said J. Michael Luttig, a conservative retired federal appeals court judge who has emerged as a Trump critic. The election maneuvering comes as Mr. Trump has pushed the limits of his executive authority elsewhere, deploying troops to blue states against the will of Democratic governors to help carry out his immigration agenda, killing people he accuses of drug smuggling in the Caribbean without due process, and directing the Justice Department to prosecute his political foes. Mr. Trump himself has hedged his willingness to recognize the midterm results only if the elections are honest, he said last month. He has insisted that he is trying only to make sure that elections are secure, pushing restrictions like voter ID, which polls in the past have shown has broad support, and seeking to limit voting by mail. The issue is vital to Mr. Trump because it weaves together two threads that are enormously important to him: his belief that he didn't lose in 2020 and his desire for his party to keep power this fall. On January 6, 2021, his effort to force Congress to reject an unwelcome election result led to a riot at the Capitol. Speaking from the symbolic seat of American democracy on Tuesday, Mr. Trump suggested during his State of the Union address that it should be my third term and declared that the only way the Democrats can get elected is to cheat. His Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, recently pointed to the administration's zealousness to root out voter fraud. We've been proactive to make sure we have the right people voting, electing the right leaders to lead this country, she said at an event on election security in Arizona. Mr. Trump often shouts fraud before an election that he fears losing, but this year he has intensified his drumbeat of threats, warnings, and false claims about voting. He began the year musing about canceling the midterms altogether. Just a joke, aides assured. Then pivoted to the idea that Republicans should nationalize them. Again, aides walked it back before the president doubled down on the notion of the federal government's getting involved. On social media and in public remarks, Mr. Trump has indulged, with increasing frequency, debunked theories about how the 2020 election was stolen. Now, those words are sometimes accompanied by government action. He warned in January that there would be new prosecutions stemming from the 2020 election, was followed days later by the FBI's search for nearly 6-year-old ballots in the Democratic stronghold in Georgia. The president has pushed Republicans in Congress to pass restrictive new voting laws and warned of more executive orders to impose them himself, even as courts have ruled against some of his past efforts. At the direction of the White House, Homeland Security officials are intensifying efforts to investigate voting by non-citizens. Control of Congress hangs in the balance this fall, and Mr. Trump has warned that he will be impeached for a third time if Democrats regain control of the House. The White House is pushing every lever to hold power, especially in the House. Last year, that included Mr. Trump's unusual drive for Republican-controlled states to redraw congressional maps to squeeze out more GOP seats, setting off a continuing nationwide redistricting war. Mr. Trump's team is also preparing a more traditional campaign, traveling, raising money, and trying to address affordability. But the active undermining of faith in the election's outcome is playing out in parallel, and the specter of a forceful federal intervention hangs over November. The federal government should get involved, Mr. Trump said in the Oval Office last month when asked about his suggestion that Republicans should nationalize elections. Naming 3 Democratic-dominated cities, he added, "If they can't count the votes legally and honestly, then someone else should take over." He was surrounded by congressional Republicans as he spoke, including Speaker Mike Johnson, who stood just behind Mr. Trump's left shoulder, his fingers fidgeting as they gripped a red Trump hat. "If a state can't run an election," Mr. Trump said, "I think the people behind me should do something about it." You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Democrats are sounding alarms, and sometimes sounding downright alarmist, as they wargame for extreme subversion scenarios. They warn that the Trump administration could deploy federal agents to target polling places and disrupt turnout, that the Justice Department could misuse private voter roll data, or that the government might seize voting machines. and they worry that congressional Republicans could refuse to seat Democratic winners. The Constitution gives Congress notable leeway to seat new members. We will have to prepare in ways that differ from prior cycles for the possibility that Trump and Republicans will try anything and everything to artificially maintain their majority, Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, the Democratic minority leader, said in a recent interview. Mr. Jeffries said he had been heartened that the Supreme Court ruled that Mr. Trump did not have unfettered ability to deploy National Guard troops, calling that the biggest tool that an authoritarian-type leader would have. In 2020, Mr. Trump had considered using the National Guard to seize voting machines. Looking back, he told the New York Times in January, "Well, I should have." Behind the scenes, Democratic state attorneys general have been preparing for dire potential scenarios and drafting legal documents to head off federal intrusion, such as removing armed forces from polling locations. Even moderate Democrats who are not prone to hyperbole are expressing deep worries. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada warned in a recent interview with the New York Times that federal immigration agents could be deployed differently. The concern, she said, is that next is they're going to bring them around our election process. They're going to try to claim the election is being stolen. Abigail Jackson, a White House spokeswoman, dismissed Democratic concerns and said Mr. Trump was committed to ensuring that Americans have full confidence in the administration of elections. No one should take this Democrat pearl-clutching seriously when they have spent years undermining and denying the results of free and fair elections, including the election of President Trump, she said, adding that Mr. Trump was simply committed to totally accurate and up-to-date voter rolls free of errors and unlawfully registered non-citizen voters. Whatever guardrails existed around Mr. Trump during his first term appear frayed or absent. He is now largely surrounded by pliant advisors and party officials. It turned out that it was a Trump appointee, Kurt Olson, who had set off the recent Georgia investigation that resulted in the FBI raid in Fulton County, according to a recently unsealed search warrant. And Mr. Trump's director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was unexpectedly at the scene. She connected him on the call with the agents. Steve Simon, the Democratic Secretary of State in Minnesota, called the federal actions largely sloppy, unreliable, even menacing. The Trump administration recently and explicitly linked a demand for sensitive voter information in the state with the restoration of law and order. I never thought in the year 2026 I would be saying that the federal government is an impediment right now to smooth elections and not an ally, Mr. Simon said. Some right-wing activists who fanned the conspiratorial flames of fraud in 2020 are no longer outside agitators. Instead, they occupy powerful seats inside the federal government. They include Kash Patel, the FBI director, who was a prominent promoter of the conspiracy theory that the riot at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, was planned and instigated by the FBI. Attorney General Pam Bondi, who traveled in 2020 to Pennsylvania, where she claimed to have evidence of cheating that never fully materialized in court. And Harmeet Dillon, who was a leader of a Trump lawyers coalition in 2020 and is now the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. Mr. Olson went from advising Mr. Trump privately in the run-up to January 6th to being named Mr. Trump's Director of Election Security and Integrity. Others are burrowed deeper in the bureaucracy. On Capitol Hill, Mr. Trump's congressional allies are planning a series of votes on legislation to impose stricter voting requirements. The measures are not expected to become law, but they amplify the false accusations about widespread fraud. Democrats have little faith in Mr. Johnson to stand up to Mr. Trump. In 2020, Mr. Johnson, then a low-profile lawmaker from Louisiana, played a pivotal role in justifying Mr. Trump's false claims of widespread fraud. In February, Mr. Johnson was talking conspiratorially in the Capitol about California's standard, but unusually long process of post-election ballot counting. The leads of Republican candidates, he claimed, had just magically whittled away. It looks on its face to be fraudulent, Mr. Johnson said. Can I prove that? No. Democrats hope the courts can prevent some overreach by the Trump administration. A sweeping executive order by Mr. Trump on election rules last year has largely been blocked by federal judges, including one in January who explained his reasoning succinctly. The Constitution, he wrote, assigns no authority to the president over federal election administration. Why Epstein inquiries yielded so few charges. This article is by Benjamin Weiser, Matthew Goldstein, and Mike Baker. It was early evening on Saturday, July 6, 2019, when Jeffrey Epstein disembarked from a private plane for the final time. Federal agents were waiting at Teterboro Airport, New Jersey, to arrest him. Is this about sex trafficking? Mr. Epstein asked as he was being driven to the FBI's office in Lower Manhattan, according to notes taken by an agent. Is this about underage? Nobody replied, but the answer was yes. Later, as he was being booked into jail, Mr. Epstein remarked, "Oh, this is bad. This is really bad." That was certainly true for Mr. Epstein, who would die in a jail cell 5 weeks later. But for the vast majority of the men and women who had either enabled Mr. Epstein or may have committed sexual assault, it turned out that there was little to fear. Aside from Mr. Epstein's longtime conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, none of his friends or associates have been criminally charged in the United States. In the 6+ years since his death, the lack of prosecutions has given rise to outrage and conspiracy theories about why powerful people have gone unpunished. The millions of pages of recently released Justice Department emails, prosecutorial memos, interview transcripts, and other records help explain why more people weren't charged and why Mr. Epstein was able to act with impunity for so long. Part of the reason was a series of missed opportunities in both Democratic and Republican administrations to bring him and others to justice. A tip that went unaddressed in the 1990s, a controversial plea deal in Florida that left FBI agents and prosecutors unsatisfied, a years-long investigation by federal drug agents that went nowhere, and a miscommunication among federal officials in 2016 that scuttled a potential investigation in New York. The records also show that in their initial zeal to quickly build a case against Mr. Epstein, federal prosecutors focused primarily on sex crimes against teenage girls in the early 2000s. Within months of Mr. Epstein's death, prosecutors believed they did not have enough evidence to charge anyone besides him and Ms. Maxwell with the trafficking of minors or other federal crimes. They lacked proof, for example, that other men participated with Mr. Epstein in a child sex abuse ring. They did have evidence of possible crimes against women, but they believed these were state offenses, not federal ones. Yet the records also show that prosecutors did not aggressively pursue other potential avenues, such as how Mr. Epstein moved his money through bank accounts around the world. They did not interview any of the men who were Mr. Epstein's main financial sponsors. Outside the United States, law enforcement is moving swiftly to build cases based on revelations in the new records. In Britain, for example, police last month arrested Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the former Prince Andrew, and Peter Mandelson, a recent ambassador to the United States, as part of their investigations of corruption-related crimes. Authorities in France and Norway have also opened investigations. In the United States, top Justice Department officials have said they do not plan to file additional charges related to Mr. Epstein based on materials in the latest disclosures, leading lawmakers from both parties to clamor for more action. Over 24 people have resigned, CEOs, members of government, worldwide. Representative Thomas Massie, a Kentucky Republican who sponsored the legislation requiring the Justice Department to release its Epstein files, said on the House floor this past week. But I haven't seen any arrests or investigations here in the United States from this Department of Justice. An unexamined tip. Inside her West Village apartment, Maria Farmer picked up her phone and looked down at the scrap of paper in her hand. It was the number to the FBI's field office in New York. It was the summer of 1996. That year, she had been growing increasingly wary of her boss, Mr. Epstein, for whom she had been hired to acquire artwork, she recalled in a recent interview. Ms. Farmer, who was 26 at the time, suspected he was a pedophile. Ms. Farmer's first stop had been the New York Police Department. It referred her to the FBI. As she dialed the number, she knew she was taking a risk. Mr. Epstein had entwined himself with powerful men ranging from President Bill Clinton to Leslie Wexner, the billionaire behind brands like Victoria's Secret. Yet because she was flagging potential crimes against children, she said, she assumed the authorities would take her call seriously. Ms. Farmer reached an FBI agent. She told him that Mr. Epstein had stolen nude photos of her sisters, ages 12 and 16, that she'd kept in a storage box as reference material for her paintings. She also said that Mr. Epstein had instructed her to take photos of young girls at swimming pools, according to the agent's notes, which the Justice Department made public to comply with a recent law requiring the disclosure of most Epstein-related documents. Ms. Farmer said Mr. Epstein had threatened to burn her family's house down if she told anyone. For months, Ms. Farmer heard nothing. She later left New York and began to move around, trying to stay in hiding from Mr. Epstein and Ms. Maxwell. She said she hoped that behind the scenes, law enforcement was building a case. Her optimism was misplaced. Neither the FBI nor the police appear to have taken action, the first instance in a decades-long pattern of often anemic responses to reports of Mr. Epstein's crimes. Years later, FBI agents would knock on her door in a remote corner of North Carolina. The agents were investigating reports of Mr. Epstein's widespread abuse of teenage girls in Florida. The girls had been pulled into his orbit in the years after Ms. Farmer's warning. A plea deal. In March 2005, the police in Palm Beach, Florida, where Mr. Epstein had a home, received a complaint from the parents of a 14-year-old girl. Her school principal had found $300 in her purse, according to a newly released document from the Florida investigation. The girl initially said she had earned the money working at Chick-fil-A, and then said the cash had come from selling drugs. Neither story was believed. She eventually acknowledged she'd been paid $300 to massage a man who turned out to be Mr. Epstein, the document says. A sprawling investigation was soon underway. The police identified as many as 27 girls and young women ranging in age from 14 to 23 who had gone to Mr. Epstein's house to perform sexual massages or had been paid to recruit others. The police found that Mr. Epstein had raped some of the girls. The state attorney's office in 2006 charged Mr. Epstein with soliciting prostitution, a felony. But the Palm Beach police believed the charge didn't reflect the scope and severity of Mr. Epstein's crimes. They brought the case to the FBI, which began an investigation. Dozens of victims told federal investigators that Mr. Epstein had abused them when they were girls. Interviews grew raw with emotion as victims described their trauma. "I wish you could have been there to see how much this has affected them," Anne Marie Villafana, the prosecutor who was handling the case, wrote to her boss, R. Alexander Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for South Florida at the time. Ms. Villafana began to expand the investigation to Mr. Epstein's opaque business empire and potential money laundering, subpoenaing his financial records from banks. Ms. Villafana prepared a draft 54-page indictment that would have charged Mr. Epstein and 3 of his female assistants with the sex trafficking of minors and other crimes involving more than a dozen girls. Those charges would have come on top of the state prostitution charge against Mr. Epstein. But the draft indictment, which the Justice Department recently made public as part of its release of millions of pages of documents, never made it to a grand jury vote. Under intense pressure from Mr. Epstein's lawyers, Ms. Villafana's superiors in the U.S. Attorney's Office struck a deal over her objections, according to a recently released statement she provided to investigators in 2019. Mr. Epstein would avoid federal prosecution in return for pleading guilty to 2 state charges, including soliciting prostitution from a minor, and he would be required to register as a sex offender. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As part of the so-called non-prosecution agreement, the federal government also pledged not to pursue charges against any of Mr. Epstein's potential co-conspirators, including the former assistants who had been named in the draft indictment. The agreement was to be kept confidential. The newly disclosed files do not provide additional insight into one of the key mysteries of the Epstein case: why Mr. Acosta engineered the widely criticized deal. He has said that trying Mr. Epstein in federal court would have been a roll of the dice. In 2019, he stepped down as labor secretary amid an outcry over the deal. On January 30th, 2008, Mr. Epstein entered his guilty plea and began serving what was to be an 18-month jail sentence. Afterward, Ms. Villafana, the prosecutor, received congratulatory messages from colleagues. "But for your tenacity," one wrote, "he'd be somewhere ruining another child's life." But she found little satisfaction in the outcome. "I don't feel like celebrating 18 months, Ms. Villafana wrote to a colleague in an email. He should be spending 18 years in jail. It turned out that Mr. Epstein would serve only 13 months. He was released in July 2009 and faced a year of home arrest. "Free at last," he triumphantly emailed an acquaintance. By then, the federal prosecutors in Florida were considering taking further action against him. In an August 2009 email, an assistant U.S. attorney there discussed with colleagues the possibility of building a case around Mr. Epstein's victims in New York, or handing the case to federal prosecutors in a different jurisdiction. But another decade would pass before prosecutors filed any charges. A DEA investigation. Not long after Mr. Epstein was freed from house arrest in the summer of 2010, a different group of federal authorities began pursuing him. This time, it was the Drug Enforcement Administration. DEA agents were investigating Mr. Epstein and others for illegitimate wire transfers, which are tied to illicit drug and/or prostitution activities, according to a memo that was prepared by federal officials and was released in January. The agents collected information about Mr. Epstein's flights, border crossings, finances, and companies. Their focus appeared to be on his activities in New York and the U.S. Virgin Islands, where he owned a private island that victims said was the site of frequent sexual abuse. In 2015, investigators produced a 69-page memo marked sensitive but unclassified that listed Mr. Epstein as one of 17 targets of the DEA case. More than 50 of the memo's pages are completely or mostly redacted, but Ms. Maxwell appears to have been among the targets. One focus of the DEA investigation was Mr. Epstein's use of his private aircraft. He had multiple planes and a helicopter, which he used to transport guests and young women to his private island. The investigation also appeared to be looking at Mr. Epstein's use of banks to move money. The memo notes that on at least 7 occasions from 2013 to 15, banks had alerted federal authorities to about $5.7 million in potentially suspicious transactions in Mr. Epstein's accounts. The outcome of the investigation is unclear, but it did not lead to charges against Mr. Epstein or his associates. Silence from the FBI. Since Mr. Epstein's release from jail, lawyers had filed a slew of lawsuits against him on behalf of victims. In February 2016, Bradley J. Edwards and J. Stanley Pottinger, who represented many of the victims, met with Amanda Kramer, a federal prosecutor in Manhattan, who was responsible for coordinating investigations into human trafficking. The lawyers urged her to open a new investigation into allegations that Mr. Epstein sexually abused girls, according to her handwritten notes and other documents about the meeting and its aftermath. At the meeting, the lawyers said that Mr. Epstein's friend, Jean-Luc Brunel, a French modeling scout who had helped get girls, was interested in cooperating with the authorities, according to the notes, which were previously reported by the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Edwards and Mr. Pottinger had other news to share. They said Mr. Epstein's non-prosecution deal in Florida had upset FBI agents who had worked on the case. In other words, The lawyers said there were ample grounds for Ms. Kramer and her colleagues in the Southern District of New York to take a fresh look at Mr. Epstein. Prosecutors eventually contacted Mr. Brunel's lawyer, who said his client refused to meet Mr. Brunel, who said his client refused to meet. Mr. Brunel died by suicide in 2022 after French authorities charged him with raping teenage girls. Ms. Kramer spoke to a top prosecutor in her office. They agreed she should contact an FBI supervisor and ask him to get in touch with the Florida agents and let her know if they, in fact, were unhappy with the outcome and felt like justice had not been served, according to Ms. Kramer's recollections, as later summarized by the U.S. Attorney's Office. The FBI supervisor never called her back, and Ms. Kramer did not follow up with him, according to the summary. She took his silence to mean the FBI agents in Florida had not actually expressed dissatisfaction with the outcome of the 2008 case. Neither she nor her superiors in the U.S. Attorney's Office took further investigative steps. A covert posture. Nearly 3 years later, the Miami Herald published a series of articles detailing Mr. Epstein's abuse of girls in Florida and his deal with Mr. Acosta to escape federal prosecution. After reading the articles, Ms. Kramer told her colleagues that she felt horrible that she hadn't followed up with the FBI in 2016, according to the summary. Now, though, the prosecutors began investigating. Jeffrey S. Berman, then the U.S. Attorney for the New York's Southern District, was shocked by Mr. Epstein's sweetheart of all sweetheart deals in Florida and felt a great sense of urgency to pursue him, he wrote in his memoir. As they raced to build a case against Mr. Epstein, prosecutors focused on conduct that had taken place in the early 2000s, the same period that officials in Florida had investigated a decade earlier. That allowed them to build on the work that FBI agents had already done. After interviewing a handful of victims, the New York prosecutors decided that they had enough evidence to seek an indictment. Going forward, they adopted what they called a covert posture, holding off on additional interviews out of fear that word of their investigation might leak. In June 2019, they decided to charge Mr. Epstein with 1 count of sex trafficking an underage girl in New York and 1 count of sex trafficking conspiracy, which involved dozens of underage victims in New York and Florida. In each location, they wrote in a memo seeking authorization to indict him. Epstein essentially operated a pyramid scheme of sexual exploitation. A grand jury returned the sealed indictment on July 2nd. The men not interviewed. Mr. Epstein was arrested at Teterboro 4 days later. On August 10th, he was found hanged in his cell in what the authorities said was a suicide. Prosecutors and the FBI were now focused on Mr. Epstein's potential co-conspirators. By December, prosecutors and agents had interviewed more than 36 of his accusers, according to recently released Justice Department memos. Women accused more than a half dozen of Mr. Epstein's associates, including Miss Maxwell, of either sexual abuse or facilitating Mr. Epstein's abuse, the memos show. Some women told investigators that they had been abused by prominent men, including Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, the billionaire investor Leon Black, the bank executive James E. Staley, and President Trump. The allegations have not been corroborated, and all 4 have denied engaging in inappropriate sexual conduct. Yet prosecutors ultimately charged only 1 other person, Ms. Maxwell, who was convicted of sex trafficking of minors and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Why was no one else prosecuted? The authorities weighed charges against at least one of Mr. Epstein's longtime assistants, Sarah Kellen, but ultimately decided not to pursue them. The apparent reason, according to recently released emails and documents, was that while Ms. Kellen had helped recruit girls and young women for Mr. Epstein, prosecutors also regarded her as one of his victims. Another reason no one else was charged is that after interviewing the accusers, prosecutors did not find what they regarded as credible evidence of Mr. Epstein trafficking underage teenagers to anyone other than himself. But it is not clear that prosecutors investigated whether Mr. Epstein was trafficking young women to other men. Under federal law, the threshold for proving trafficking is higher when it comes to adults than for minors. Prosecutors interviewed 1 victim, Virginia Giuffre, who was 16 when she met Mr. Epstein, and said she had been lent out to and abused by other prominent men, including the former Prince Andrew. But prosecutors said they could not corroborate her accounts. No other victim is described being expressly directed by either Maxwell or Epstein to engage in sexual activity with any other men, the prosecutors wrote in a December 2019 memo summarizing the investigation. Recently released emails suggest that Mr. Epstein may have been connecting wealthy acquaintances, including Mr. Staley, Elon Musk's brother Kimball, and Steve Tisch, the co-owner of the New York Giants football team, with young women. Mr. Tisch has acknowledged discussing women with Mr. Epstein, but hasn't directly addressed his interactions with them. Kimball Musk has not denied dating them, one of Mr. Epstein's assistants, but said they met through a friend, not Mr. Epstein. Mr. Staley has admitted having consensual sex with a woman he met through Mr. Epstein. Federal prosecutors did not interview any of those men. Nor do they appear to have investigated the rape and abuse allegations made by women against Mr. Black or Mr. Staley, instead deferring to the Manhattan District Attorney to investigate alleged violations of state laws, according to the files. Rape is generally not a federal crime, though it can be a component of federal offenses such as sex trafficking. The district attorney did not file charges. A lawyer for Mr. Staley declined to comment. Susan Estrich, a lawyer for Mr. Black, said that there is absolutely no truth to any of the allegations against Mr. Black, and that state and federal authorities conducted lengthy investigations before deciding not to charge him. Sifting through tax returns. Federal authorities took steps to examine Mr. Epstein's finances and vast wealth, but those efforts were limited and nothing came out of them, according to the recently released documents. Early on, the FBI had listed Mr. Wexner, the retail tycoon who was one of the main sources of Mr. Epstein's wealth, as a potential co-conspirator. But prosecutors never interviewed Mr. Wexner directly. Instead, they spoke to his lawyers a few weeks after Mr. Epstein's 2019 arrest. The lawyers said Mr. Wexner had cut ties with Mr. Epstein around 2007 after discovering that he'd stolen at least $100 million and that Mr. Wexner had been unaware of Mr. Epstein's sex crimes. The files do not show signs of further investigation into Mr. Wexner. His spokesman said that a prosecutor told Mr. Wexner's lawyer that they saw him as a witness, not a target of the investigation. After Mr. Wexner and Mr. Epstein split, Mr. Epstein's most important source of money became Mr. Black, who paid him $170 million over several years. Federal investigators do not appear to have closely examined that financial relationship, in which Mr. Epstein dispensed tax and estate planning advice. He also counseled Mr. Black on paying millions of dollars to several women, including how to structure payments so they could be treated as gifts for federal tax purposes, according to recently released emails. Federal authorities subpoenaed records from Deutsche Bank, where Mr. Epstein had dozens of accounts that were used to pay young women and wire money to banks in Russia and Eastern Europe. But by late 2019, before FBI agents had interviewed a number of Deutsche employees, the prosecutors seemed to have cooled on the prospect of bringing any charges. In a memo that December, they added that they found no immediate indication of financial criminal activity or misconduct at the German lender. To this day, there has not been a comprehensive follow-the-money investigation of Epstein's network performed by any federal law enforcement agency, said Senator Juan Wyden of Oregon, the top Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, who has spent years digging into Mr. Epstein's finances. I find that totally inexcusable. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 1st issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Kathy. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 716-821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. A Braille version of the schedule is also available upon request. Our number again is 716-821-5555. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print